everybody, and welcome to The Untold with Haiti Buzo. As the world continues to struggle with the pandemic and the virus that came out of Wuhan, China, the problems with China and its ruling party, the Communist Party of China, continues. Today, we will be talking about so many issues, their ongoing issues with this specific country. And joining us to talk about this, Michael Sobolik Fellow in Indo-Pacific Studies at the American Foreign Policy Council. And we are also joined by Michael Mazza, who is a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Thank you so much both for joining me today.
Thank you. Pleasure.
All right, well, let's start with the pandemic. This is an issue that the whole world is suffering from. We are here at home. Many people are struggling on so many levels because of this pandemic that doesn't seem to end. Can you tell us a little bit more about your views on this issue and how is that also affecting the views of our people in the United States and actually the world on China and its role in the world?
The outbreak has been a clarifying event, for many people in the United States, but from what we're seeing globally as well. And when I say clarifying, what I mean is I think it's made quite clear why the Chinese Communist Party poses such a potent threat to U.S. interests, but also to the interests of many other countries. That's not to say that the United States has handled the outbreak here perfectly. Of course, it has not handled it particularly well. But we're in the situation that we're in now because of the way China behaved in the early days.
What would you like to add to this, Michael? Because this is just one other layer of the problems that the world has been having with China. I mean, there are 18 countries today that have border disputes with China, who are bordering China. I mean, China has so many issues with so many countries. It's really beyond just having or grasping all of this in one episode. But how do you view this specific issue with the Wuhan virus that basically hurt everybody around the world?
So the question is a really good one, Haiti, because it's in some ways it's difficult for Americans to wrap their heads around the security challenges that China poses to its neighbors. I mean, you just mentioned the amount of border disputes. Americans haven't had a border dispute in about over a century or so. So it's understanding how China views this and trying to make sense of where the world is going right now is not an easy thing by any stretch of the imagination. But I think Mike is right when he says that in large part we are where we are because of the actions of the Chinese Communist Party on the other side of the world. So I think one way to start looking at this is to look at the flow of how the Communist Party of China responded to the outbreak, starting at the beginning of 2020, then looking at where we are now. If you rewind the clock and trace, say from February to where we are now, you'll see a very distinct foreign movement progression from the party that began initially with a clampdown of information inside of China, silencing physicians, doctors, people who were just discovering the existence of the virus in Wuhan. The second movement, which we began to see in March, where the party began, instead of silencing the people, to try to work with their population to deflect blame for their poor response to the virus. And you saw a lot of nationalism baiting, like rumors that the US brought the virus to China and other propaganda pieces like that. The third movement, when the virus was absolutely out of China and spreading into the region and frankly to the entire world, you saw the Communist Party engaging in a global push to be seen as a net health goods provider, particularly with protective equipment, masks, ventilators, stuff like that. When countries began to realize that the masks were either defective or the same masks that they had previously sold to China a month or two ago, and now they were then having to pay a profit to get them back, there was a lot of pushback, rightly so, at the Communist Party. And the fourth movement that the party has been in since March, April, and certainly where we are now, is leveraging any power that it has to control speech globally within China. Absolutely, that's continuing, but to control the actions and the speech of governments around the world and to shape perceptions favorably of the party, and they've not been afraid to use economic aggression with Australia and other countries to try to manage the damage reputationally that they've incurred from this.
This is very important because we are talking about the fact that there's not only been trying to hide from the world what happened in Wuhan, but also silencing the people who wanted to warn the world. And we also saw what happened with the American journalists who were pushed out of China. And now there are Canadians who were taken hostages by the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, there's so many issues to talk about, but I do want to go to Mike quickly about an article that you wrote in the American Interest, and you talked about 6 do's and don'ts and to how to respond to China in general. And you covered so many issues. Can you give us in a nutshell about this article and what are you recommending for the United States to do at this point?
So, my basic concern in writing the piece and the argument I was trying to make was that there is a risk as we respond to COVID-19 and seek to hold China accountable for its misdeeds here, there's a risk that we will sort of lose sight of the longer term strategic competition with China. And there are certain steps that we might seek to adopt in order to impose costs, which again could be counterproductive over the long term. So in my piece, I sort of try to thread that needle. How do we do both? How do we respond to COVID-19? How do we hold China accountable? Which I think is important to do, and do so in a way that advances our interests, our longer term interests vis-a-vis China. And there's a number of things that I discussed in the piece. Just a couple of, I think, important points to highlight. I think the WHO investigation that's about to get underway.
World Health Organization, yes.
Yeah, the World Health Organization. Is about to launch an investigation with China's cooperation. To say that it will be a farce may be a bit too strong of a word, but we're not going to get a critical take on the CCP's role here. And that's a problem. So I think the United States Congress itself should set up an investigatory committee, can set up independent commissions in the past. This is something that we do. Ideally, you staff it with an international group of scientists, epidemiologists, sinologists, who can look into the virus's origin, how it spread within China, how it escaped China's borders, look at the Chinese Communist Party reaction, and build a more fully developed picture of the course of events, the timeline over the last 6 months. And from there, you can talk about imposing costs. And I think one way to do that is to target the Chinese Communist Party directly. So, for example, we could start publicizing briefings on the private wealth held by senior Communist Party members. You don't go right to the top. You want to be able to escalate. You maybe start at sort of the top 100 guys and work your way up, signaling that you can go all the way to the top if you need to do so. The other thing I'd say is that COVID-19, and I hate to use this phrase, but it does give us an opportunity to pursue some interests that we've been long seeking to pursue. So in this particular case, I think the relationship with Taiwan has an opportunity to truly blossom in a way that maybe it didn't in the pre-COVID-19 world.
There's so much to talk about here, but I do want to go back to Michael and to talk about technological aspect of China in its history of stealing Western technology and getting away with it for so long. And then to talk a little bit about Huawei and how the countries right now, thankfully, in the Western world are responding and ending these contracts with that specific company. Can you tell us a little bit more for our listeners and our viewers to understand the background of the story and what's going on with Huawei as we speak?
Happy to. So China and its relationship with the global economy, you could trace it back to the days of Deng Xiaoping, which was China's second primary leader after Mao Zedong. Deng was responsible for adjusting China's economy away from a purely socialist Marxist economy towards an integration of capitalist elements into the economy. That culminated when the United States established permanent normal trade relations with the People's Republic of China, especially when we let them into the World Trade Organization in 2000, 2001, turn of the century. Since then, as China has been integrated and really become a global manufacturing hub for the entire world, that did volumes for their ability to grow economically. But because the Chinese Communist Party has had greater ambitions than just being a global manufacturer, they needed to find a way to leapfrog technologically very quickly, because you cannot compete with the United States if you remain a manufacturing economy. You have to get into the advanced elements that define 21st century life. So China's strategy to do that has been to acquire intellectual property by any means necessary in the world's most strategic sectors. So Huawei is a great example of this. In the day and age we live in 2020, the move to 5G networks, it's difficult to overstate how revolutionary this technology is going to be for the lives of everyone in the entire world. The move from 3G to 4G made streaming a lot more seamless. The move from 4G to 5G is going to bring magnitudes of technological breakthroughs with remote medicine, autonomous vehicles, smart cities among them. So China knew this years before we came to where we are now, where companies are just now starting to bring 5G technology to market. So the Chinese government backed financially the company of Huawei, which was founded, I believe, somewhere in the 1980s by a former PLA, People's Liberation Army officer. And because Huawei has been state subsidized, they're operating in a market economy where their competitors are not state subsidized, which means they can undercut all of the competition. And if you couple that with stealing critical technology, you have rapid developments of capability at extremely low cost, which is impossible for other companies to compete with. It's just not, it's not in the cards. So the big shock to the United States happened earlier this year, before the coronavirus really became the thing that it is now. And it was the 28th or the 29th of January when Downing Street announced that they were going to allow Huawei equipment into a limited portion of their 5G networks. This was a really big deal, because not just the special relationship that has defined Britain and the United States for so long, but Britain is a Five Eyes partner, which is the most elite club of intelligence sharing: the US, Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This is where the crown jewels of defense technology is shared among. And to have, not just Britain, not just a 5G partner, but as a NATO partner as well, having critical equipment that is controlled by the Chinese government, and that economy brings an incredible amount of risk, not just for surveillance, not just for interception of information, but for sabotage of operations. And I wrote about this in March of this year. And the point that I tried to make in a report that I did through AFPC, the organization I'm with, is that any company in Europe or any country in Europe that is part of NATO and has Huawei equipment in their national networks, even if it's not in quote unquote the most critical elements of the core of a network, even if it's at the edge of the network, Huawei still has the ability to intercept traffic. And because of that, if you're in a defense context and critical information relevant to mobilization or operations are traveling over those networks, you're tipping your hand to the Chinese Communist Party before you do something, which is by any accounts a problem for the United States and for the West in general. So the issue of Huawei and the technological race is not just an esoteric one, it's a real one.
Myself, as someone who was born and raised in an authoritarian country, a dictatorship, we're talking about a country that does not treat its people fairly, does not have institutions, does not have a rule of law, does not respect international law, and having those abilities puts everybody at risk, not only the Chinese people, but we're talking about this ability, this kind of technology that is taken from the West to be used against the free world. And this is a scenario that is very dangerous. And I don't believe there's enough discussion about this issue, even today. I did want to ask you, Mike, because this is also India, for example, just yesterday, they banned 58 Chinese apps, including TikTok, for security concerns. So what are those apps, and should other countries follow suit, in your opinion? Because if India is concerned about these apps, and we're talking about a different level of technology here, obviously 5G is something much more massive, but even those apps, I mean, those are on people's phones and they're people's devices. So should we be concerned here at home as well?
Was that question for me or Michael?
Yes, yes, that's for you, Mike.
Yeah, look, absolutely. I mean, the Indian case there's a couple of things I think mixed up here. So they've cited security issues for the reason for the blockings, which there's certainly an element of truth to that. But this obviously comes on the heels of this major border dispute, the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers, and so this is certainly also a retaliatory measure. But when you look at the apps that were canceled, the sort of the most prominent among them, most well known to Americans, will be TikTok, which is very popular here in the United States. I'm not all that familiar with it because I refuse to download it. But this is an app which is owned ultimately by a company based in China. And so we have the same concerns as we do vis-a-vis Huawei. It's not the same exact set of concerns. TikTok isn't providing internet infrastructure for us, but there are concerns about data privacy, where our data is going. There are concerns about censorship on the app. And so when we get into conversations about blocking apps wholesale, I think we need to tread carefully, right? We have a free market system here in the United States, which has benefited us quite well. But it's reasonable to ask if Twitter and Facebook are banned in China, why should Chinese equivalents have access to the U.S. market? And I think, generally speaking, they probably should not.
It is a very important topic to discuss and to talk about, I think, among everybody. I deleted TikTok from my own phone. I absolutely recommend people to delete it as well, because, like we said just now, this is a regime that does not respect human rights, international law, doesn't have institutions. I mean, it is a concerning issue to have this app in people's phones, and maybe to look into other technologies that are coming from China as well. What would you like to add about this, Michael?
The only thing I'll add to that, and I think I agree with Mike's take on it, the actual process of how TikTok swipes the information off of your phone. The reports that I've seen suggest that anything that you copy to your clipboard, either from your phone or on a connected device that's synced to your larger cloud network, anything that you put on your clipboard, if you have a TikTok account and it's on a device that you use, that information is potentially exposed to TikTok's data collection operations. I think the proper way to view TikTok is not primarily as a social media app. It's a data mining endeavor thinly disguised as social media. And I think that is the real pernicious thing about it. And it's reflective of the larger issue of how the Chinese Communist Party operates. There's always a velvet glove over the iron fist. And this is why discretion and prudence are really important.
Mike, you also talked in your article about the 3 million Muslims that are in concentration camps today in China. This is another element. I mean, we don't talk about this a lot, but those are a minority in China we don't even know what type of treatment they're getting. There are so many claims about what's going on there. But if you can share with us a little bit about this, we know that there were new sanctions because of this issue, the human rights violations, specifically against the Uyghurs. But what do you believe the right approach for our country and other democracies in retaliation for how China is treating these minorities? I mean, we're talking also about Christians. You mentioned in your articles that there are pastors and priests that are being imprisoned. There are also other reports of churches being demolished in China.
Yeah, look, I mean, look, China is one of the worst human rights abusers, on the face of the earth right now. And the situation for Muslim minorities, Uyghurs in particular, is especially hard. I think certainly the actions that China is undertaking amount to crimes against humanity, and quite possibly fit the definition of the legal definition of genocide. The latest report just out a day or two ago indicated massive forced sterilizations, other family planning measures to prevent Uyghurs from having children. We know there's been reports of torture in the camps, reports of sexual violence, really mind-numbing stuff. So what should we be doing? You're right. And the president just recently signed legislation which would allow him to impose sanctions on Chinese officials engaged in carrying out these atrocities. We should absolutely do that. Perhaps the most effective thing we could do would be to admit Uyghur refugees in large numbers. It's not something that we're doing right now, I don't believe. And I think it's time to take a really hard look at the Winter Olympics coming in Beijing in 2022. For the past year or so, I've been arguing that we should use those, or try to use those, as leverage to secure improvements for Uyghurs and others undergoing persecution in China. It's getting late to try to use the Olympics in that way, and I think we need to start thinking about organizing a boycott movement. There is no good reason that the Olympics should take place in China in 2022.
This is one of the issues, but let's talk about also Hong Kong, because it's so concerning to see what China is doing in Hong Kong and how they're now persecuting activists, human rights lawyers, people on social media. They're blocking social media tools and accounts. What is the right approach? And you did write an article about this at Newsweek, talking about 4 different scenarios for Hong Kong. Tell us a little bit more about how you see this unfolding.
Sure. So on the one hand, what we're seeing right now in Hong Kong is just a pure tragedy. It's heartbreaking to see a city that has become to be globally known as a beacon of freedom, not just free enterprise, but political freedom, go down this dark path of what feels like a sort of final subjugation to the political control of the Chinese Communist Party. So on the one hand, this is just a really, really sad time. But in another way, it's also very curious, because the United States sent plenty of signals to Beijing that if they were to introduce national security legislation for Hong Kong and railroad the Legislative Council in Hong Kong, that they would face consequences. And this has been codified in US law for a very long time, ever since 1992, that the economic treatment, the cultural treatment that the United States affords Hong Kong is unique and different from the mainland, is contingent on it being actually autonomous from the rest of China politically. So that's just no longer the case anymore. So the question is, why would China take that step of ending an arrangement that frankly was very beneficial for Chinese Communist Party elites economically, and also beneficial economically for the country? Why would they end that arrangement knowing that it would come at a cost from the United States? In that Newsweek piece that you mentioned, I laid out a few different scenarios to try to understand why. And just briefly, the reason I chose to approach it that way is because there's a very healthy impulse in Washington right now that the days of that we should really seriously review the engagement policy we've had with China for a long time. I think that's a good impulse. It's correct. It's going in the right direction. But there's also a strain of finding the closest club or 2x2 board we can find and just whack China with it in kind of an astrategic, guttural way. If we're serious about competing effectively with the Chinese Communist Party, we need to relearn a lot of strategic basics that we got pretty good at with the Soviet Union, but have been fairly rusty since 1991 or so. And the process of competing has to include looking at the world through the eyes of your opponent or your competitor. So I laid out a few scenarios to try to see from the party's perspective what could explain this behavior. And the first to get to this question of, well, maybe this was primarily based for internal reasons. Maybe on the one hand, China decided to just cut its losses. They would have preferred to de-escalate the protests in a peaceful way, but the resources politically devoted to Hong Kong began to become a strain for the party. They just needed to clear the decks and focus primarily on economic relief from the coronavirus and get some breathing space. So on the one hand, maybe they were just cutting their losses. On another hand, maybe it's a little more intense than that. Maybe you have pressure on elites, Xi Jinping in particular, who has been in the driver's seat for what is objectively a disaster for the Chinese economy, for the foreign policy of the country with the coronavirus and their complicity in it, which we began the conversation talking about. So maybe he needed to deflect blame away from the party leadership towards the United States ultimately, as China's accused us of being a black hand, kind of guiding these protests from afar for a long time. So cracking down on the protesters in Hong Kong is a great indirect way to also score some easy points politically among the Chinese population for Xi Jinping and the CCP. But maybe, so a third scenario, maybe it's not an internal issue. Maybe this is a strategic issue for the party. If you think about it, the conversation that we had a few minutes ago about China's technological race to catch up to the United States, to catch up to the rest of the world, this is contingent on China exploiting a very specific window of opportunity. Jiang Zemin talked about this in 2002 or 2003, where he said that China had a very specific window of opportunity as the United States was just becoming engaged in the global war on terror to fly under the radar and accrue a lot of national power and influence without ruffling a whole lot of feathers. If you look at the calendar, that window is supposed to close in 2 or 3 years, but realistically, this window began to close at the tail end of the Obama administration, and certainly now with the Trump administration, where you have a lot of people waking up throughout Washington that China has been exploiting the international system in a lot of ways. So if you look at it, cracking down on Hong Kong doesn't exactly buy you a whole lot of time, because if anything, you prove even more than people already believe, that the Chinese Communist Party is a threat to freedom, a threat to global norms. I mean, that they violated a treaty with Great Britain by taking this action with Hong Kong. But if you look at the other actions that China is taking more recently, specifically trying to buy up strategic sectors to try to jumpstart their economy very quickly, cracking down in Hong Kong was, from their perspective, perhaps a small price to pay for the technological angle they're going to get by, hopefully from their perspective, being the first economy to emerge from the coronavirus. The final scenario is the most alarming. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most likely, but the most alarming scenario could be perhaps the party believes that their complicity with the coronavirus really shot their entire strategy in the foot to leapfrog the United States. And you see not all governments, certainly in Europe, but a number of governments reevaluating relations with Taiwan at small incremental levels. You see Britain taking steps towards reversing their Huawei decision. And perhaps the party is calculating that their effort to cleave Europe from the United States is going to fail. And if that is the case, then what's happening in Hong Kong could be foreshadowing a forthcoming spat of really dangerous adventurism and militarism. For the record, I don't think that's the most likely scenario. I think if you look at all those and take them in stock, China right now is probably realizing that there is no peaceful way to take down these protests at this point, and they are doing the only expedient thing politically, which is to move on, even at great cost in the short term.
Well, I think the question that arises from this is, how do we respond to this? And I know that taking away the open economical advantages that Hong Kong had is the way. Is there another way to help the people in Hong Kong maybe preserve the sovereignty that Hong Kong had for a century?
Those are the right questions to be asking, undoubtedly. First, to your question about can we save Hong Kong's autonomy, I'm highly skeptical at this point that we can, which is a really unfortunate thing to say out loud. But at this point, with China's Congress passing this legislation, there is very little short of high stakes escalation that the United States could do to get China to back off, and maybe even that wouldn't be successful. But then the question is, what other actions could we take and to what end? I think that doing everything we can to help Hong Kongers get out of Hong Kong if they want to, and if they express a desire to, is a no-brainer at this point. Sanctioning high-level officials both in Beijing and in Hong Kong who are complicit and responsible for this is absolutely a step that we should take to punish their actions. The tricky part with Hong Kong at this point is any punitive action we take is just that. It's punitive. We're not in a strong position to shape the behavior of China because they've already taken the action we don't want them to do. But on a lighter note, briefly going back to your conversation with Mike about Xinjiang, one way to think creatively for people who are in currently dire distress, the Uyghurs in particular, there are a lot of levers that the United States can pull to get China's attention here. One in particular, you can't really separate what's happening in Xinjiang from the larger One Belt, One Road initiative. One of the big reasons that China's cracking down on the Uyghurs is because they need the autonomous region of Xinjiang to be predictable for them to be able to have these massive supply chains going through. So thinking broadly with Xinjiang and the Belt and Road actually presents some really interesting opportunities for America, specifically instead of just focusing on sanctioning individual people in the party. I think we should begin to consider sanctioning commerce that passes through Xinjiang from China to other countries and vice versa, because then you're hitting not just individual people, you're hitting the larger framework and the system that the party is trying to build. Mm-hmm. And that could go a long way to getting their attention.
Well, that's an important point. What would you like to add to this, Mike? Because this is a very important question. How could the United States and its Western allies and the rest of the countries who are also have so many problems with China and its behavior respond to those abuses, to those violations of international law, of trade agreements, etc.? What is the right way? And is there another way for Hong Kong? I mean, it's a tragedy to see what's happening there.
Yeah, look, I'm pretty much, I think, in violent agreement with Michael here. I don't think there's a whole lot that we can do at this point to sort of roll back the measures that the Chinese have imposed on Hong Kong. So, I agree. Again, it's sort of same as with the Uyghurs, that we make it very easy for Hong Kongers to come here if that's what they want to do. I think it's sort of morally the right thing to do. Strategically, it also potentially accelerates that brain drain away from China, which is potentially a good thing for us. But looking beyond Hong Kong, I think it's important to ask ourselves, what does this mean about the direction China is going to take going forward, and how can we be best postured to deal with that? And I worry very much about Taiwan. I think that
was going to be my next question, because Taiwan is a great story, is a country that is a democracy and helped so many people during the pandemic shipping masks to so many countries and medical equipments and etc. I mean, this is a country that definitely deserves the protection of the United States and the Western world.
Yeah, look, absolutely. Taiwan's handling of COVID-19 was truly remarkable. They have under 500 cases, I believe only 7 deaths. To your point, they've been generous in sharing both non-faulty medical equipment, but also their knowledge and experience, including going to countries which only very recently broke diplomatic ties with them to switch to Beijing, going to them and sharing their experience to try to help them through this crisis. So Taiwan has acquitted itself very well over the last 6 months. I think one of the reasons, again, not the most important reason, but one of the reasons China has been willing to act in the way it has in Hong Kong, willing to so quickly push this law through, do so secretly, really put to paper quite draconian measures, is because they recognize, Xi Jinping recognizes that peaceful, uncoerced unification with Taiwan is impossible. It's off the table. It's not going to happen. That means he doesn't care what Taiwan thinks about what he does in Hong Kong, and that's troubling. He's made clear his intention to pursue unification. I think this is no longer a long-term, maybe someday goal. I think he wants it done. I think there's the prospect for a crisis.
So you're talking about the Chinese president?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's his plan for Taiwan.
So he's made clear that unification with Taiwan is an important piece of the China dream, or the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. It's one of the sort of the bullet points in that plan. He can no longer deliver on the economic promises. Now, the Chinese economy was arguably already stagnating before COVID-19, and now it's in big trouble. So if he can't deliver on the prosperity that he's promised all the Chinese people, what can he deliver on? Well, he just delivered on Hong Kong, and he may be tempted to try to deliver on Taiwan next.
Hong Kong is basically going to lose all of the privileges that it had before because of the open and free market that it enjoyed. Now that China is trying to put its hand on it. Taiwan is a country that has so many technological developments and scientific discoveries. I mean, this is a very advanced country. And what are the scenarios, Michael, in your opinion, for the United States and its allies to protect a country like Taiwan from these plans that Mike just mentioned? Protecting
Taiwan from a military invasion has to be, especially now after what we're seeing in Hong Kong, protecting Taiwan has to be one of the top strategic and military objectives of the United States, for reasons that go beyond just our history with Taiwan. I mean, if you look at the past 70 years, even though we have an unofficial relationship with Taiwan today, the commitments and the law-bound obligations that the United States has to Taiwan are very real, and the strategic importance of Taiwan is really, really difficult to exaggerate. Not just for geopolitical reasons. I mean, China would certainly love to have Taiwan as a military base for their deep sea submarines in particular, and to break through further into the Pacific Ocean. But from a symbolic perspective, Taiwan in many ways is a referendum on the credibility and the reliability of the United States. I mean, the difficult thing here is you have a lot of countries, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, they're all watching very closely to see how we stand with Taiwan. And yet at the same time, none of them, for very understandable reasons, none of them want to get drawn into a shooting match over Taiwan. And let's be really clear, nobody in the United States wants a shooting match either. That is not a scenario that anyone is pursuing. So the question of how do we avoid a conflict and yet still maintain Taiwan's independence, I mean, this is the $1 million question. I think a few steps are really obvious to take. I think one, Continuing on the symbolic road, an easy thing to do is to get the Taiwanese military into the Rim of the Pacific naval exercises, either as an observer or as a participant. The reason this is important and will matter is because China used to be a participant, but we kicked them out of the exercises in 2018 for spying on the rest of the countries in the exercise.
What a surprise.
I know, it's very true. When I went out to Hawaii, I'm a recovering Hill staffer, and in 2018, when I was working on the Hill, I went out to Hawaii during the RIMPAC exercises to observe them. And the substance of the exercises are one thing. It's a lot of disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, but the real value added from these are the relationships that the United States Navy builds with officers in Japan, Australia, and everyone else who's there, and integrating Taiwan in a relational way and in a reputational way is really, really important. Another thing that we should be doing in compliance with the Taiwan Relations Act is to actually conduct a thorough assessment about whether or not we have the military capability and capacity to defend Taiwan's independence. This is an obligation that is in United States law. And it's been a while since there's been a comprehensive review as to whether or not the United States, when you rack and stack what we have versus what the People's Liberation Army has, it's probably time to redo an assessment and see how we stand and see what investments we may need to do. And then finally, I think another really important piece, and to the administration's credit, I think this is something that they are doing right now, is to find really creative ways to upgrade their relationship. Because America's Taiwan policy, and for that matter, our one China policy, it's ours. It does not belong to China. We can interpret this in many ways, regardless of what China thinks and whether or not they like it. This may seem like a small thing to know, but the State Department has begun retweeting stuff from official Taiwanese Twitter accounts. This has not really been done before. And it's a small step, but it's recognizing a deeper level of engagement that is also public. Signaling in any way we can that we value Taiwan and that we increasingly value Taiwan is always a good thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And we are talking also about the fact that the countries surrounding China, including not only South Korea, Japan, like you said, Philippines, Taiwan, and India as well. All these countries have problems with China. We saw the escalation in what happened when the Chinese soldiers killed 20 Indian soldiers in a horrifying way. But also, how could India play a role in confronting China at this point, especially that it has its own grievances with the Chinese Communist Party moving forward? And I would ask you this question, Mike.
It's a great question. So India has sort of been this great hope of Washington China hawks over the last decade or maybe 2 decades now. And I think that we should continue to invest in that relationship. We just need to be realistic about what we can expect. India is very much invested in its strategic autonomy. I don't think we're going to see something which looks more like an alliance anytime soon. But I think alignment is possible and perhaps much more likely in the aftermath of just what we've seen over the past 2 weeks at the border. I think what the United States can reasonably hope for is an India which has an economy which is living up to its potential, which is experiencing healthy economic growth. There's not much we can do about that. That requires reform in India. I think what we can hope for is an Indian military which is well trained and well armed, and we have been assisting with that, and I think we'll continue to do so. And if that is the case, then even if India is not coordinating particularly closely with us and with Australia and Japan as we might like, there's still a very, very big thorn in the side of the Chinese Communist Party, at least sort of distracting China from looking east, soaking up resources on the border, and I think that that's certainly within reach. If the relationship evolves beyond that, I'm all for it. I just think we need to keep our hopes in check.
And why is that? I'm kind of interested to know, why do you think we have to keep our hopes in check? Because it seems that the relationship is growing with India. There are also some talks about India becoming an economical partner, buying some products from India, not from China anymore. What do you think of the idea of shifting our market away from China, and that India could potentially be a partner in that way as well?
Yeah, look, I think we've just been continually disappointed by India over the last 12 years or so. Again, I think that there were very high hopes after we signed the nuclear agreement in 2008, I think it was, and the relationship has just sort of proceeded in fits and starts since then. The other point I'd make is I think it makes both economic and strategic sense to diversify away from the Chinese market and to diversify to India, among others. But India's own market-based reforms have slowed quite a bit, as far as I understand it. There is a protectionist impulse, which is not always beneficial to doing business with India. And so I'm not saying we give up on that, but India, at least on the economic side of things, and in the relationship with the United States, has not proven itself willing to make or take very big steps forward.
What do you think about this, Michael?
I think a great starting place to understand some of both the challenges and the opportunities the United States has with India is to rewind the clock back to the 1940s. So you had the dissolution of the British Raj, where India, what used to be the crown jewel of Britain's overseas colonies. And in the 40s, in the wake of World War II, Britain began to unwind a lot of their colonies, among them India. And in 1947, you have simultaneously Indian independence. And then you also have the partition where India and Pakistan are separated. And you have this ongoing border issue that is at the highest level of strategic interest for both countries. India, as a former colony, has had a lot to deal with as an independent country. And again, like, sometimes this is difficult for us as Americans to understand. One of the best things that I think the United States can do as we seek to partner with India more and more is to refrain from pushing our cookie cutter format of how relationships should look, and to be very willing to afford the same respect to India that we would ask India to give to us, and to allow the relationship to move at a pace that makes sense for the two of us. I think a common complaint among a lot of China folks in Washington is that stuff with India moves so slowly, and the defense agreements that Ash Carter began to negotiate when he was a DoD secretary, and I think it was culminated in 2015. Those efforts and the subsequent agreements that were signed took a very long time to sign, like longer than it usually would with any other country. But here's why I think there's also some hope here. What's happening on the border right now between China and India, we are seeing some of the really good results of the hard work we've done with our defense relationship with India. At one of the highest points of India's claimed territory in Ladakh that abuts the lower level of Xinjiang, close to where a lot of these border skirmishes are happening, India has the highest altitude air base at that location of any country in the world. And India has been using strategic airlift capabilities that we sold them. So, I mean, I think that's a great thing. And I think it's easy to overlook something like that. But I think if we're patient, and I think if we are willing to work with the Indians as a partner, and certainly not dictate to them, and of course we wouldn't expect to be dictated to either, we're both sovereign countries, but I think that as long as we're willing to keep moving forward at an appropriate pace, I think there's a lot of possibility. And I think that, I mean, Mike's right. There are a lot of outstanding issues, one of them being India's reliance on Russian military equipment. This was a big fight on Capitol Hill just a couple of years ago. It's going to take a lot of patient work. It's going to take a lot of good diplomacy, but I think there's a lot of strong potential ahead for both countries.
What other possible potentials also for the trade agreements shifting away from China? Michael, you did mention also about the Silk Road and where the Uyghurs are. This is a very important area where the United States could apply pressure. Also, how to kind of shift our buy-in market from China to other countries. What do you think, Mike, would be an attainable alternative as we are shifting away and decoupling from China?
I think we want to focus our efforts on India, but also Southeast Asia. So, as you know, we withdrew from the Trans-Pacific Partnership right at the start of the Trump administration, which would have tied the United States in with 11 other economies on either side of the Pacific Ocean. There were good economic reasons to withdraw from that agreement. I would have rather seen a renegotiation, but that ship has sailed. But that being said, I think there's a lot of there's great opportunities to expand our economic relationships in meaningful ways with what are called the VIP countries, in particular, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines. All have young populations, healthy economic growth rates. Vietnam and the Philippines in particular have been interested in a free trade agreement with the United States. Vietnam was part of the TPP process. The Philippines did a lot of the preliminary work to join the TPP. I believe that was all pre-Duterte. But these are countries where the economic potential is really, really enormous if they make the right decisions themselves. And if we partner with them, that can only boost their own development in ways that would be beneficial to the United States.
Michael?
It's a good question. I think just to add one country to the list of potential partners for free trade agreements, let's look no further than Taiwan. I mean, this is not a new debate. This has been a long-standing question in Washington, and there hasn't been a whole lot of action forward on it, in large part because of how the Chinese Communist Party would react to us signing a free trade agreement with Taiwan. I think that, especially given what we've seen about China's conduct with the coronavirus and the larger strategic concerns we have, I think it's time to begin reassessing our priorities for whose approval or disapproval we should care about more. But I'll answer your question in more detail, taking a different approach. So on the one hand, you have positive sum relationships that we need to build, and Mike just did a really great job laying out ways that we can integrate economic relations with other countries. On the competitive side, with China, as we begin to decouple more, I think a big question for us to come back to is, as we look for leverage that we can use, particularly economic leverage, whether with tariff sanctions or what have you, I think a really important question is to what end? What sort of behavior are we trying to shape or incentivize or de-incentivize with the CCP? I think a really good example, to return to Xinjiang, if we were to crack down on commerce passing through the region, the ideal scenario would be that China would then recognize that these sanctions are tied to how they're treating a religious minority in a completely indefensible and atrocious and inhumane way, and that they would stop. I'm critical and skeptical enough about the character of the Chinese Communist Party that I don't see that as a possibility. But there's another potential outcome here. With sanctions, you not only have the ability to shape behavior, but shape how resources are spent. So if you begin to drain China's ability to fund Belt and Road commerce with US dollars, you then put them in a difficult position. Either they need to use alternative forms of currency, which for global trade is difficult to do. It's certainly not impossible, but it's very difficult. It's time consuming. It's more expensive, and you have to go to great pains to hide it. So I guess all that to say, if by virtue of economic leverage, we can force China to spend more resources on things that they would like to do, that means they have less resources to do other things that threaten our interests and the interests of our allies.
I think, this is conclude our conversation for today. This is a very important topic, and I know that a lot of people want to learn more about this country and how the Chinese Communist Party is basically hurting its neighbors, and it's a danger to the rest of the world. And you wrote this, Mike, in your piece. You talked about the 66% of Americans actually now view China negatively versus only 2 years ago. And I think education about this issue is very important for the people to realize what are we up against at this point. Thank you so much, Michael Sobolik and Michael Mazza, for joining me today. I would love to hear your thoughts and your questions. Please like and subscribe. Thank you all for listening to The Untold with Heavy Buzo, and see you next time.